Everybody, welcome back to our series on bibliology. Today we're discussing the issue of the copies or the manuscripts of the Greek New Testament. I should say from the get-go that a lot of the content that I'm going to share today really comes from my old Greek professor from seminary, Dan Wallace. He's got just a lot of really helpful things to say on this issue. If you're interested in studying more about this, I would point you his direction. He's got a lot of really helpful things to say. In our last session in this series, we're talking about this question. When it comes to the copies of the Bible that we have today, can we really be sure that what we have in our hands today is the same thing that was written down thousands of years ago? When I open my Bible and I just turn through the pages, can I really be sure that what I'm looking at represents what was written by Paul and Matthew and John? And I'm convinced that the answer to this question is a resounding yes. But first, let's talk about why this is really even a question in the first place. What's the problem? Well, in order to understand the issue, we really have to understand something about how we even got the Bible that we have in our hands today. About 2,000 years ago, the books of the New Testament were written down by hand. And as the message of Christianity, the message of the Bible spread around the world, lots of people wanted to read the Bible. And so what you have is the different books of the Bible being copied down meticulously by hand, by scribes. They would sit down and literally just copy word for word, very, very carefully, Matthew or Acts or Romans or eventually even the whole New Testament. And then those copies were made, but more people wanted to read, and so copies of those copies were made, and more copies and more copies. The books of the Bible weren't just copied into other Greek copies. They were also translated into other languages as well, languages like Latin and Coptic and Syriac and so on. And so as Christianity spread like wildfire, so the books of the Bible were copied over and over again by hand. Now, as time went on, the actual original documents, the actual physical pieces of parchment that Paul and Matthew wrote on, they wore out and were lost to history. We don't have any of the original documents left. Perhaps one reason they wore out is that so many people wanted to make a copy of them. We no longer have any of the original documents, but we do have thousands of copies. And as those copies were made, the reality is that sometimes the people making those copies made mistakes. They copied maybe the wrong word or they misspelled something. Now, here's the thing. It's important to understand that these differences among the copies don't in any way impact the fact that the letters of Paul or the original letters of the New Testament were without error. Imagine if I were to email you directions to my house, and then your printer's out of ink, and so you write down by hand the directions on a napkin, but you make a mistake. You spell one of the streets wrong. That doesn't mean that I made an error in the original. It just means that you made an error in the copy. And so even today, if you were to sit down and copy a Bible verse and you make a mistake, that you didn't just break inerrancy. The original writing is without error, but sometimes, as people make copies of the Bibles, there are errors. There are variants. That's what the differences between the copies of the New Testament are called. Well, okay, so there's variants. How many are there? There's a lot of variants. There are probably more than 400,000 copying variants in the New Testament. Some people like to point out that, that's even more than there are even words in the entire New Testament. Some people hear these stats, and just the sticker shock alone makes them say, well, if that's the case, then there can be no confidence whatsoever that what we have now represents what was originally written down. So how do we deal with this? Can we really trust the Bible today if there were so many variants in the copies? The answer is yes, and let me tell you why. First, the vast majority of variants raise no cause for concern whatsoever. It's important that you know something about the kinds of copying mistakes or variants that we find among the manuscripts of the New Testament. The first thing you need to know is that 99% of the copying variants that were made have no impact on really determining the original meaning. Here's some examples of the kinds of variants that we have among the handwritten copies. First, there are spelling variants. In Greek, there's something called the movable nu. In other words, it's kind of a fielder's choice if you want to include it or not. Maybe a similar thing today would be that there's an old-fashioned way of spelling the word shop. Today, we would spell it S-H-O-P. But back in the day, they'd spell it S-H-O-P-P-E. Now, there's kind of two different ways you could spell this word, but is there really any question if you were reading it as to what the original word was? No, you understand exactly what the original word was. Just because one copy spells a word a different way, that counts as a variant, but it doesn't mean there's any confusion over what the original word was. Likewise, sometimes as scribes were copying by hand the New Testament letters, sometimes they made spelling mistakes. But usually it's pretty clear to see what happens when someone misspells a word. There's not really a big question over what was really originally being written down. Second, sometimes when you find differences or variants among the copies of the New Testament, some of the mistakes are just so blatantly obvious that it's a mistake that there's really no serious question as to what the original was. Dan Wallace, again, gives this example of a verse in 1 Thessalonians where Paul says, quote, "We were gentle among you." So you have all these copies of 1 Thessalonians, and they all say, "We were gentle among you," and one of the copies says this, "We were horses among you." Well, clearly, one of the scribes made a mistake as they were copying this down. Now, in Greek, those two words are actually spelled in kind of similar ways, and so you can understand why he would make a mistake. But really, just because there's this one outlier, there's really no question as to what the original was. 99% of the variants are like that. They really create no problem at all. But, okay, that still leaves the 1%. What do we do with this? The truth is that there are places among the New Testament manuscripts where there is real debate. What was the original wording here? Well, here's the second reason that we can trust that we have the original. One way or another, the original wording has been preserved. It's important that you understand that even where there's some debate over is it option A or option B, it's important that you understand one way or the other, the original wording has been preserved. Let's look at an example. Maybe if you have a Bible in front of you, you can open it up to John chapter 8. If you turn to John chapter 8, maybe you've noticed this before, but the first 11 verses are bracketed off. Most Bibles will have a note. Mine says this, quote, "Later manuscripts, or later copies, add the story of the adulterous woman." That's what the first 11 verses are in chapter 8. So what that's saying is this. Well, some of the later copies that were made in time include the story, but the earlier copies do not. There's a legitimate debate here. Which is it? Is this part of the original, or was it added later? We can have an honest debate here. Were these verses original or not? But make no mistake. One way or another, the original wording has been preserved. So can we trust that the Bible is really reliable if there are so many variants? Absolutely. First, 99% of the variants raise no real cause for concern. Spelling, that kind of thing. Second, of the 1% of genuine questions we have, one way or another, we can have confidence that the original has in fact been preserved. Third, among the passages like John 8, and there's others like that, no essential Christian belief is affected by the questions that exist. Even Bart Ehrman, he's one of the most prolific opponents on the reliability of the New Testament. Even he wrote this, quote, "Essential Christian beliefs are not affected by textual variants in the manuscript tradition of the New Testament." So even opponents of the reliability of the New Testament will agree no essential Christian doctrine or essential Christian belief is affected by different variants. Now, one more reason, and there's so much to be said about this. This is just a quick look. But one more reason that we can have such incredible confidence in the reliability of the text that we have is this. There are thousands upon thousands of copies of the New Testament. Again, Dan Wallace loves to say, we have an embarrassment of riches when it comes to the copies of the New Testament. If you take a look at the copies that we have of other ancient documents, there were other ancient documents written other than the Bible, and people made copies of those documents. Do Do you know what the average number of copies that we have for each ancient Greek document? It's a mere 20 copies. Now, probably the one that has the most copies is Homer's Iliad. We actually have 2,000 copies of that. We have extreme confidence of what the original wording is. But when you look at the copies of the New Testament, you find a completely different picture. In Greek, we have close to 5,800 copies of the New Testament. Now, some of those copies are very small, some just the size of a credit card, but others contain much of the New Testament. The average length of a New Testament manuscript is 450 pages long. We have not 20 copies of the New Testament, not even 2,000 copies of the New Testament, but 5,800 Greek copies in varying lengths of the New Testament. But that's not all. The New Testament it wasn't just copied into Greek, it was translated into other languages as well: Coptic, Syriac, Latin. There are 10,000 ancient copies of the New Testament in Latin alone. But here's the deal. Even if you lost all of those manuscripts in Greek and in other languages, the early church fathers, they loved to write commentaries of the New Testament, and they would quote the New Testament. So they're not making a copy of the whole book of John or something like that, but as they're writing their copy, they would quote from the New Testament. And those are witnesses to what the original wording says. Dan Wallace says that among the church fathers, there are close to 1 million quotations from the New Testament in their writings. Now, compare the number of handwritten copies of the New Testament to the copies that we have of any other ancient document, and what you find is that we have far more evidence for the original biblical wording than we have for any other ancient document. The evidence for the original wording of the New Testament is astounding. Here's the thing. The reason there are so many variants among the copies of the New Testament is that there are so many copies of the New Testament. Let me illustrate it like this. Let's say that I was teaching in a huge auditorium. And let's say that there's only one person in the audience. And I put on the screen John 3:16, and I said, okay, sir, please copy this verse down word for word. Now, if there was only one handwritten copy, how many variants would there be among the copies? Well, none. There's only one copy. That's scenario one, but what about scenario two? Let's say that in this scenario, I have not just one person, but thousands of people in the auditorium. And I put John 3:16 on the screen, and again, I said, write it down by hand, please. Which scenario, scenario one or scenario two, which scenario would you have more typos among the copies? Well, clearly, scenario number two. There's thousands of people writing this down, thousands of chances for mistakes. But let me ask you this. Which scenario would give you more confidence that the original writing had been preserved? I'm going to take scenario two every single time, even though there would be more differences among the copies. That's a little bit of a picture of what we have in the New Testament. Yes, there are variants, but there's variants because there's so many copies. The reality is that we can have just such incredible confidence that what we have today in front of us accurately represents the original words that were written down so very long ago. As I think about this, I'm just so amazed that God has preserved for us His inspired, inerrant, and authoritative Word. The Bible truly is the greatest book ever written.